In this video, we're going to talk about some of the basic things you need to do to get the Terminator X up and running on a Foxbody. On this 1991 Foxbody, it didn't take much at all, but I will still walk through some of the basic steps so that you can get your car up and running quickly. First thing we're going to do is we're going to turn on the ignition, but not start the engine. Okay, and then while the handheld boots up, it's going to prompt us for a TPS auto set. So we're going to go ahead and do that. The TPS auto set is important because this tells the EFI system when the throttle is at idle and also when it's at wide open. And if it doesn't know either of those things, a lot of other functions will not work properly. So we're going to make sure that the ignition is on, the engine is not started, and that's correct. And then we're going to slowly press the pedal to the floor and then slowly release it. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm slowly pressing the pedal to the floor and then I'm slowly releasing it. I did it twice. The TPS auto set was successful. If you want to double check to make sure that it is actually, that your TPS is set correctly, we're going to go to the monitors and then idle, and then looking at the TPS position, it should read 0 at idle and it should read 100% at wide open, and I'm doing that with my foot here. 0%, 100%. Okay, we're good. So with the TPS set, we're ready to start the engine. Now, another thing that we need to do is we need to set the static ignition timing. And that's just like you would do with a factory EFI system, where you pull the spout and set it to 10 degrees or whatever you want. We need to do the same thing with this because the fuel injection system doesn't know where your distributor is cranked to. So we're going to go to Tuning, System, Ignition Setup, Static Timing. Now, if we set this to 0 or to 1 degree and we set our timing to that, it doesn't matter. You can choose any number you want, but the engine's probably not going to run at 1 degree. So we're going to choose, say, well, we can try 1 degree if you want. Let's try it out. Something else. Let's see here. Okay, let's try to set that. Yeah. Well, it didn't like it a whole lot. It's chugging pretty good. But the point is, now our timing is actually at 1 degree. It's 1 degree. It's locked at 1 degree. So that way we could take our timing line out and set it to 1 degree, and then we're good to go. We're going to actually do, when I did this before, I set it to 15 degrees because I knew that the engine would run at that. I have fat fingers here. There. So we're going to set it to 15 degrees. Yeah, now of course the engine responded a lot more favorably to that. So this is where we would get the timing light out, and I've already done this, but we get the timing light out and we set the ignition timing to 15 degrees on the balancer. And that way, then you know that the timing, what the EFI system is commanding on timing, is actually what the cylinders are seeing. Now that the engine is up and running, we want to make sure that the throttle blade is set at the correct angle so that it's allowing enough air to get in so that we're not riding the idle air control motor too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Monitor, Monitors, and then Idle. Now this shows that the TPS is at 0%, which is what we want when we're at idle. Our target engine RPM that we've set is 700 RPM, and the idle air control position is at 38%. This is a bit of a moving target. Holley says they want this around 2%, and sometimes it's at 2%, sometimes it's at 40%. It seems to vary quite a bit. The important thing I think is that the ignition timing is also controlling idle, and you can see it's varying a little bit to keep the idle from surging. And so this ignition time is extremely effective, by the way, to keep the engine from surging like 5-liter Mustangs always do. So the idle air control position, it'll vary. Like for example, it shows 38% to keep the engine at 700 RPM. I'm going to give it a little bit of throttle, and we can see that the idle air control position is going down because I'm above my target idle position right now, see? So it's going down. But now I'm going to release the throttle, and you'd think it would go back up to 40%, but it doesn't. It just holds at 6% now, and then the timing is still controlling the keeping the idle stable. So, like I said, it's a bit of a moving target, but the important thing I think here is that make sure that this idle air control position is not 0. If it's 0 all the time, then that means that the idle air control motor is not controlling idle at all. So that's one position. And then also if it's say 100% or 50% or 80%, then you know that your throttle blade is not open enough to control the idle. So those are the key things to do when you're trying to make sure that your the EFI is effectively controlling the idle. The only thing I really needed to change settings-wise on the Terminator X was the tuning of the acceleration enrichment. Since this has a stock cam, this was it needed a lot less acceleration enrichment than was in the factory, you know, the Holley EFI's can to tune. So to get it to rev cleanly like this, when I would blip the throttle, before it would load up a little bit. So what I did is I went to tuning, and I went to advanced, and then I went to advanced fuel, and then I did acceleration enrichment. And then there's acceleration enrichment versus TPS rate of change. I left that one alone, but what I did do was I changed it versus the acceleration versus map change rate of change. And what I did is I turned this graph down. I made this, before it was a steeper angle, and I turned this down a bit. I've cut it in half roughly, and that cleaned up my my neutral revs and stuff like that. And that kept the engine from loading up when I would blip the throttle for like a downshift or something like that. But other than that, the car runs really well, and I'll show you when we go for a drive. Okay, we're gonna go for a drive. Now, one thing that's important to do when you first start driving with the fuel injection system is you drive with at a steady speed. You don't want to be the fuel injection does not modify its base fuel table during transitions. So that means changing throttle position, blipping the throttle, slowing down, that kind of thing. You want to keep a constant throttle position, drive gently at some different engine loads and engine speeds to try to get let the Terminator's wideband oxygen sensor sense what the adjustments need to be made to the fuel table in that area. Now, as you're driving, you need to make sure that you're driving gently, and you don't want to be going on wide open throttle or anything like that. But that'll also, the more time that you spend at different places in the fuel map, I guess you could say, the better off you're going to be. But one thing you're going to notice is that right out of the box, the fuel injection system works extremely well. I mean, we're not stalling, we're not surging. It's really astounding. One thing that I needed to adjust was the engine had a tendency to load up a little bit when I had a lot of throttle blips. Now it revs cleanly. Before it would just kind of load up a little bit, and that's where I changed that acceleration enrichment versus manifold air pressure sensor rate of change adjustment. So I backed that down to about half to maybe even about a third to help it stay clean when I was revving the engine. But other than that, I mean, runs extremely well.